Bismillah. By the time Scott shaved and dressed, he was able to float to the kitchen on the aroma of baking blueberry muffins. Dory made them when she could find fresh blueberries at the supermarket, a hit and miss proposition in Florida. Ordinarily, he would have commented on the special treat when he entered the kitchen, but today he was quiet, and while he knew she had undoubtedly heard him approaching, Dory did not look up from what she was doing to greet him. Scott's chest tightened when he saw her spine stiffen against the natural urge to turn to him, smile, tiptoe, to kiss him on the cheek and tell him good morning. They were still the same people, yet they were different. The change in their relationship had left them uncertain of ick odor and, worse, uncomfortable with ick odor for the first time since they had met. Scott opened the cabinet and took out his mug. It was a familiar weight in his large hand, reassuring as he poured himself coffee at the coffee maker, reassuring until he looked down at it and read the caption he had almost ceased noticing in the long months he had used it, Superstat. Dory's matching mug said Super Broad. They had bought them at a flea market simply because they were so utterly tacky. Only now, his was just strangely apropos in light of what he had just learned. Scott slammed it on the counter in disgust, and the hot coffee sloshed onto the countertop and over his hand. He kissed and plunging his hand under the faucet, turned on the cold water. Dory looked at him, wide-eyed. Are you okay? Just stupid. Your hand? The cold water will take care of it. She started at him questioningly, and he answered the unasked question, read to make. He braced his hands on the edge of the sink and laughed bitterly. Superstar. That says it all, doesn't it? Mr. Macho with sperm capable of penetrating rubber and surviving spermicidal jelly. Dory closed her eyes, wincing. Please don't, Scott. He answered with a sigh. He looked down at his hands and his shoulders sagged. It won't change anything, she said. That was Dory, always the pragmatist, pointing out the realities of a given situation. Scott wished he could be anywhere else at this moment, anywhere he could escape from the reality she would not let him ignore. He heard the cabinet door open, the rattle of dishes. Dory stepped behind him and slid her arms around his waist, offering him the cup and saucer in her right hand. He took it, then covered her left hand with his, pressing it into his ribs. She kissed his knee, then snuggled her cheek against his shoulders, her breast pressed consolingly into his back. We don't have to talk about it now, she said. It's going to be months before I'm even showing. Until then, she drew in a shuddering breath and lifted her cheek from his shoulders. Why don't you have some coffee? How about you? He said. She lifted a glass from the counter and said, Orange juice and of caffeine. Oh, he said, of course. Caffeine will not be good for baby. He drank heartily from his own cup, as tough the hot coffee might burn away the despair closing in on him. Dory peeped into the oven to check the progress of the muffins. Apparently satisfied, she took out a skillet. Do you mind cooking your own eggs? She asked. Scott cast her a surprised look. Cooking eggs was no big deal, but he could not remember Dory ever having asked him to cook for himself at her apartment. She was a whiz with scrambled eggs, beating them just right, whipping in a smidgen of milk so that they were fluffy, adding just the proper trace of pepper. Dory handed him the carton of eggs. To his questioning look, she said, rather embarrassed, "I'm not. I have not had a lot of trouble with nausea, but for some reason, raw eggs." Scott put the carton back into the refrigerator. "I don't need eggs. It's okay, really, as long as I don't have to see them raw. There is no reason for you to give them up." "Cholesterol?" Scott said. After a bit they both laughed. Dory had been lecturing Scott about cholesterol ever since they had met, and he had consistently turned a deaf ear. It had become a joke between them. Scott touched Dory's neck and traced the line of her jaw with his tongue. "It feels good to laugh. I was not sure we ever would again." Dory closed her eyes and nodded agreement, then stepped into his embrace. She put her arms around his waist and her cheek against his chest, savoring the familiar warmth of his solid body, hearing the regular pumping of his heart beneath her ear, smelling the combination of her soap and his aftershave. Scott, so familiar, so deep. Involuntarily, she pressed nearer to him, closed her arms to hug him tighter. They did not talk. They did not need to. Everything they would have said was telegraphed in the way their bodies touched with an unself-conscious familiarity. Scott pressed a kiss on her forehead, then picked up his cup and saucer and went to the table to drink his coffee. Dory watched the muffins until they were done, then popped them into a napkin-lined basket and carried them to the table. "What are we doing today?" Scott asked. After battering and devouring one of the muffins and reaching for another, "I did not make any plans," Dory said. "What do you feel like?" "The weather scenes," Scott said. "Something outside, maybe. The Junior Museum." "I had like that," Dory said. "We could take in a movie afterward," he said, and she nodded agreement. It was an unhurried day. Dory rejoiced in the freedom of cotton pants, an oversized t-shirt and sneakers in lieu of the business suits and pants she wore during the week. They followed the nature trail at a leisurely pace, stopping from time to time to soak up the peacefulness of the outdoors. When they talked, it was to point out something along the way. A bird perched on a limb, a squirrel flirting with them from the far side of a tree. Content in the serene surroundings of the museum grounds, they skipped lunch out together, opting for an early dinner on the way to the movie. On the way home, Dory tried unsuccessfully to stifle a yawn and hoped Scott would not notice in the dark interior of the car. But he did. "Tired?" he asked. She said, yielding to the inevitability of another yawn. "Must be all the fresh air today." "Must be," Scott agreed. But they both know fresh air did not usually make Dory tired, and an uncovered awareness of the real reason for Dory's fatigue reverberated in the air between them. When they reached the apartment, Dory excused herself to change into a kaftan. Eh bien. Although she had not mentioned it to Scott, the elastic waistband of her slacks had turned into vice. She returned to the living room and found Scott watching football on television. "You should have told me the Gators were playing," she said, dropping onto the couch next to him. "We could have skipped the movie so you could watch the first half." Scott grinned and leaned over the keys, her briefly on the lips. "No football game is as important as spending time with you. Except maybe the Georgia game, Dory teased, or the Florida State game. That one we go to together, he said, dropping his arm around her shoulders. Father still can't get used to my sitting on the gator side, she said. You had think I had defected to Russia. You just saw the light, Scott said. Now switching from the gator side to the Seminole side, that would be worse than defecting to Russia. You are almost as bad as he is, Doris said. You are both little boys when it comes to that stupid college rivalry. I'm on the gator payroll, darling. I can almost understand your attitude since you have never really left college. But father's been an alumni since before I was born, and he still can't stay gator without perfecting it was damned. I had be willing to be he can't say my name without perfecting it which it with that damned gator either, Scott said. He uses the term with affection. Doris said, he likes you and you know it. Despite your connection to that little school in Gainesville, she cozied closer and let her head drop against the inviting warmth of his chest. Scott ran his hand up and down her arm and kissed the top of her head. Careful, you might fall asleep. Dory agreed, succumbing to the lethargy, slowly seeping taut her muscles. She was nearing deep sleep when Scott's chest vibrated under her ear. Have you told them yet? No. An awkward silence followed. I will not tell them before telling you, she said softly. I will not do that. Scott made a strained clicking sound of frustration in the back of his throat. Don't be surprised if your dad comes up with a few more colorful names for me after you do. Gator will be an endearment. My family knows how it is with us, she said. They are not going to be thrilled. They will be shocked, Doris said, just like I was, the way you are now, but when they think about it, they will be hopping mad as hell, and it won't be at you. She sat upright to face him, nose to nose. They are not going to be mad. They are going to be surprised, and then when they think about it, they will realize. Ah, you are their daughter, Dory, and I am the man who knocked you up. Dory drew in an involuntary shriek. Is that how you think of this situation? That you knocked me up? What we have is not a seedy one-night stand or a tacky little affair. I know that. Then I wish you would not talk about a new life in such vulgar terms. He was just being realistic about how they are going to see this, Dory. Don't expect your mother to take up knitting. A laugh rose up in Dory's throat, part bitterness, part incredulity. My mother would be menaced to society with a pair of knitting needles. I was not trying to be funny. You were not succeeding. They glared at each other a moment. Finally Scott drove his fingers through his hair and groaned. Why though? What we had was perfect. Why the hell did this have to happen? After a very long silence, Dory stood up and looked down at him. I'm tired, Scott. I'm going to tuck in early. Do you want me to go with you? Go ahead and watch the rest of the game. I hope you got ours. Neither of them bothered with good night. Early the next morning, Scott sat in the chair at Dory's makeup table staring at Dory. Asleep, she looked small and vulnerable in the double bed. Her face was shield-like in repose, and her hair painted a dark slash on the light pillowcase. He tried to see something different about her, flashed the fact she was pregnant, but it was too soon for that. Sleep had even erased the dark circles under the eyes. She was simply Dory, the same Dory he had fallen in love with on the cruise ship. Why, he thought. Oh Lord, why did it have to happen? And what was it going to do to their relationship? And how was he ever going to deal with it? Dory woke up and cocked Scott, looking at her. He was fully dressed. Good morning, sleepyhead, he said. What time is it? She asked groggily. 10:30. Why did not you wake me up? You needed the sleep. Memories of their conversation the night before crowded into Dory's consciousness as she shook off the last remnants of sleep. She closed her eyes. The memories did not go away, so she opened them again. Branch, she asked. One of us is on the verge of starvation, Scott replied dully. Give me 20 minutes. I will be in the living room reading the comics, he said, rising. He was almost through the door when Dory asked, Did the gutters ring? Yes, he said, but there was no satisfaction in his voice. Despite her hearty appetite and the lush spread of fruits, vegetables, meat, bread and cheese, Branch that day was quite possibly the most miserable meal Dory had ever endured. Scott appeared to be just as miserable as she was, picking at his food and grimacing at his first taste of the coffee. Their attempts at conversation fell short, turning into cryptic exchanges that made them both uncomfortable. Dory dropped a dollop of grape jelly on her skirt, and Scott somehow typed over the cup of coffee he had not drank, then dabbled affectuously at the spill while the dark stain spread pervasively over the white linen cloth. Do you want dessert, or do we leave before we knock over a serving cart or two? Scott asked. I vote for leaving, Dory said. I don't recall seeing anything on the dessert table that blended with grape jelly purple. The quiet in the car was even worse, until Dory sighed miserably and Scott reached over the fold, his hand around hers, until he drew both their hands back to rest coopered together on his thigh, until he leaned over at a stoplight to kiss the tears stained on her cheek. He embraced her when they reached the parking lot at her apartment, and she put her arms around his neck and buried her face against his neck and hugged him as though he had just rescued her from a burning building. His arm was across her shoulders as they walked to her door. Inside, they clung to each other and kissed frantically. They had tasted the possibility of losing all that was special between them, and now had been granted the hope of recovering it. Scott lifted his lips from hers and whispered urgently, I can't live without loving you again. Together, almost as though their separate bodies were appendages of a single being, they walked to the bedroom and took off their outer clothing. Scott adored her nearly naked body with his eyes, then while kissing her, unsnapped the front closure of her bra and cupped her breast in his hand. Dory gasped and twisted away just slightly. Scott lifted his head and gave her an inquiring look. They are a little sensitive, she said. It's normal, just be gentle. He guided her to the bed and they lay down together. He touched her breast again, lightly this time, then took the tip of one in his mouth when it swelled under his palm. Dory urged against him, explored the length and width of hard muscles on his back. They shifted so that he was atop her, and her body moved under his in gentle undulations of invitation. Impatiently Scott shoved his fingers inside the elastic of her panties and shoved them down. Dory cooperated, kicking them away, then opened to him. Urgently, Scott shed his own underwear and then buried himself in her. She locked her legs around his, holding him close. They moved together, frenziedly, until he spilled himself inside her, then lay atop her, breathing heavily while his heart pounded noticeably against her sensitive breast. Dory combed her fingers caressingly through his hair and pressed soothing kisses on his forehead and temple. Eventually he slid away from her, yielding the ultimate intimation but leaving his thigh over hers and his arm across her waist. "Did you?" he asked. "No," she said, "but it is okay. I enjoyed it." He raised his large hand to cradle her face tenderly. "Do you know how special you are?" She put her hand over his, stroking the back of it sensuously. "It's special with you," she said, and tough she could not tell him. That made even a baby seem right. She had now, immediately she could not destroy his shield, the shield they had created together, and now she knew that she would love it, no matter what. He leaned forward to kiss her, and then, gently, began touching her with arousing brushes of his fingertip, while his mouth plundered hers. His hand eased lower, stroking, until he eased his finger inside her. She gasped into his mouth as the heel of his hand settled over her and then moved, playing her body like a fine instrument, creating the friction he now from experience would bring her to the same magic that had just consumed him. Everywhere he touched her, every way he touched her was an affirmation of caring. Dory grasped his shoulders in a desperate grip, clinging to him as the world telescoped into pure sensation. She cried out as the spiral waves of magic convulsed through her. Her body tightened, then eased against his, her hands caressed instead of clang. The strokes of his fingers soothed rather than crossed. Dory's breathing slowed to normal as she listened to the reassuring pulse of his heart close to her ear. Her last cognizant tapped before she succumbed to sleep was that sweetness so profound could produce nothing except sweetness. Dory woke to the flirting sensation of tiny kisses on her eyelids. When she opened her eyes, Scott smiled down at her. "I fell asleep," she said groggily. "I hated to wake you up, but it is almost 4. 4?" she said incredulously. "It can't be. Oh, Scott, I'm sorry, our time—" "It's all right. I have had you next to me." He shifted and his swelling penis pressed against her tight. Dory reached for it, wrapped her hand around him lovingly, stroking, felt him large and expand within the circle of her fingers. His sigh had an aphrodisiac effect on her senses, arousing her. Still caressing him, she buried her face in the hair on his chest, then soft the flat nipple on his right breast and teased it with her tongue. It hardened and she sucked on it. Desire surged tapped her as his flesh pulsed under her hand, and a growl of male arousal tore through his throat. He rolled back, urging her astride him, and guided her face to his, hungrily accepting the plunder of her tongue as they kissed. Dory eased her most warmth over his waiting erection and gasped as he filled her. She set the rhythm as Scott squeezed her firm buttocks, guiding, urging, controlling. She was the first to climax, her tight, flanking ears pressed into solid muscle and hair sprinkled male flesh as she convulsed with the force of orgasmic ecstasy. After several suspended seconds, Scott rolled her under him and pumped into her frantically, claiming, dominating as he found turbulence, then peace. For a long time after he collapsed over her, neither of them moved. Then Scott, softening abandonment with soft kisses, slid off her and sat up, dropping his feet over the edge of the bed. "You don't have the get up?" he said softly. "As if I could," she murmured lethargically and smiled up at him. He walked to the bedroom, then brought her a washcloth and stood patiently while she laved the moisture of their lovemaking from between her legs. Later, after he had showered, dressed, and packed, he brought her the Sunday paper and kissed her on the forehead. "I will see you in 2 weeks." Dory nodded, afraid to trust her voice because of the lump in her throat, by the time he had reached the bedroom door. However, she had swallowed the lump and risked calling his name. He stopped and turned back to look at her. Dory discovered that she did not know what to say. They started at each other for almost half a minute, then spoke at the same time. "Dory, Scott." Scott exhaled heavily and ran his left hand through his hair. He was holding his suitcase in his right hand. "I will be all right," Dory said. A lame platitude. It was the best she could do. "Sure," Scott said and squared his shoulders well. Dory conceded defeat. "See you week after next." Scott hesitated. "Dory, just go, please." Still he hesitated, lingering in the doorway as tough his decision to cross tough, it would be irrevocable. Finally he mumbled, "Bye," and took the definitive step.